A young CEO ignores a drenched girl asking for shelter on a stormy day. Without a second thought, he turns her away and moves on with his life. Years later, bankrupt and out of options, he goes to a job interview, only to discover that his new boss is the same girl he once humiliated. Now, she holds the power to decide his fate. The rain poured down in sheets over New York City, turning the bustling streets into rivers of umbrellas and hurried footsteps. Ethan Walker pushed through the revolving doors of his company's towering headquarters, clutching his leather briefcase over his head in a futile attempt to shield his $1,000 suit. His day had been long and frustrating. A deal had fallen through, his assistant had messed up his lunch order, and now this downpour was the perfect end to a perfectly terrible day. Ethan checked his watch impatiently. His driver was late, probably, stuck in the gridlock that always plagued downtown when it rained. Lightning flashed across the darkening sky, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. That's when he noticed her, a young woman huddled beneath the small overhang of the building's entrance, her clothes soaked through, her arms wrapped around herself in a desperate attempt to find warmth. Their eyes met briefly. Hers were wide, tired and oddly determined despite her bedraggled appearance. She took a hesitant step toward him, water dripping from her hair onto her already soaked shoulders. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely audible above the drumming of rain on pavement. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could I stay here until—" "The rain lets up a bit. I missed my bus, and the next one isn't for another hour." Ethan sized her up in one dismissive glance. Her clothes were cheap but clean, her sneakers worn at the edges. Not homeless, he decided, but certainly not someone who belonged in front of his building either. "This isn't a bus shelter," he replied coldly, adjusting his cufflinks. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks down." The woman didn't move. "Please," she tried again, her voice steadier now. "I'm not asking for money. Just a few minutes out of the rain." Something about her persistence irritated him. This was his building. Well, technically, his company leased 8 floors of it. But the principle remained the same. Success meant not having to share your space with just anyone. "Look," Ethan snapped, "this is private property, not a public waiting area. I suggest you find somewhere else." Just then, his sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Relief washed over him as the driver jumped out with an umbrella. "Sir?" The driver nodded, escorting him to the car. As Ethan slid into the dry leather back seat, he caught one last glimpse of the woman. She hadn't moved, but her expression had changed. A mixture of hurt and resignation that, for the briefest moment, made something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Then the door closed, the car pulled away, and he was already checking his emails. The encounter forgotten before they'd even turned the corner. 5 years can change everything. Ethan stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of his studio apartment. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the beginning of gray peppered his once perfectly trimmed hair. He splashed cold water on his face and tried to ignore the stack of past-due notices piled on the kitchen counter. The fall had been swift and merciless. First came the whispers of financial irregularities, not his doing, but his partner, David's secret dealings that had gone unnoticed under Ethan's watch. Then the investigation, the frozen assets, the endless parade of lawyers. The company's stock plummeted overnight. Investors fled. And while David somehow managed to escape to some non-extradition country with millions, Ethan was left to face the music. He hadn't been charged in the end. There wasn't enough evidence to prove he knew about the fraud, but his reputation was destroyed. No one wanted to hire the man who had either been corrupt or too stupid to notice corruption happening right under his nose. His savings dwindled rapidly, then vanished altogether as he fought legal battles and struggled to maintain some semblance of his former lifestyle. "You need to be realistic," his last remaining friend Mark had told him over coffee yesterday. "You can't keep waiting for some executive position to magically appear. You need income now. Ethan had bristled at first. He wasn't some desperate job seeker. He was Ethan Walker, for God's sake, or at least he had been. There's this new tech company, Mark had continued, sliding a business card across the table. Horizon Industries. They're expanding like crazy, and rumor has it they're looking for experienced people. Not at CEO level, he added quickly, seeing the spark in Ethan's eyes. But it's something. Better than nothing. Ethan had pocketed the card reluctantly. That night, after his internet was shut, off for non-payment, he'd gone to a local cafe with free Wi-Fi and sent his resume. He'd had to update it first. It had been over a decade since he'd needed one. The reply came unexpectedly fast. Mr. Walker, we've reviewed your credentials and would like to invite you for an interview tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please confirm your attendance. No mention of the scandal, no hint that they recognized his name. Just a standard corporate response. Ethan had stared at the email for a long time. Before replying, this wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was meant to build an empire, not join someone else's. But his bank account was empty, and his landlord's patience was running thin. I'll be there, he typed, hitting send before he could change his mind. As he walked home in the gathering dusk, he wondered if this was what it felt like to surrender. Horizon Industries occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Manhattan. Ethan straightened his tie as the elevator climbed, smoothly upward. He'd spent his last bit of cash on getting his one good suit dry cleaned, and even then he knew it was noticeably outdated, the lapels too wide, the cut slightly wrong for current styles. Still, it was all he had left from his past life, and he clung to it like a lifeline. The doors opened to reveal a sleek reception area bathed in natural light. Modern art adorned the walls, and the furniture had that minimalist aesthetic that screamed success without trying too hard. It reminded him painfully of how he'd designed his own offices, back when he had offices to design. Mr. Walker? The receptionist smiled politely. Please sign in and take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly. Ethan scrawled his name and sat on one of the ergonomic chairs, legs crossed, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. Around him, young professionals hustled by with purpose, carrying tablets and chatting about product launches and market penetration. They looked so certain, so secure in their futures. Had he ever been that young? This way, please. A sharp-dressed assistant appeared beside him, gesturing toward a hallway lined with glass-walled conference rooms. Ethan followed, noticing how the employees they passed barely glanced his way. Once, people had stopped conversations to acknowledge him when he walked by. The assistant opened a door to a corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Ms. Carter will be with you momentarily, she said, pulling. The door closed behind her. Ethan stood by the window, gazing at the skyline he once dominated. From here, he could see his old building, where Walker Enterprises had occupied the top floors. Now, some other company's logo glowed where his had been. The door opened quietly behind him. Mr. Walker, a woman's voice said. Thank you for coming. In today. He turned, professional smile already in place, hand extended for a shake, and then he froze. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in a simple yet elegant style. Diamond studs glinted at her ears, small, tasteful, but unmistakably real. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Those same determined eyes that had looked at him from beneath dripping wet hair 5 years ago. Please have a seat, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice betrayed nothing. No hint that she remembered him, but the slight curve at the corner of her mouth told him otherwise. Thank you for the opportunity, Ms. He began, his throat suddenly dry. Carter, she supplied smoothly. Olivia. Carter, CEO of Horizon Industries. She placed her hands flat on the polished table between them. Now, let's discuss why someone with your history would be interested in joining our team. Ethan's mouth went dry as he tried to formulate a response. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, desperately seeking employment from someone he'd once dismissed without a second thought. Life had a strange way of bringing things full circle. "I believe my experience speaks for itself," he managed finally, falling back on the practiced lines he'd rehearsed in front of his bathroom mirror. "Despite recent challenges, my track record of building successful teams and driving growth remains solid." Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "Interesting choice of words. Challenges. Is that what you call a company-wide collapse following fraud allegations?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "As the investigation concluded, I wasn't directly involved in any wrongdoing." "No, you weren't," she agreed, flipping through his file. "Just oblivious to it happening under your watch. Some might argue, that's worse." The conversation was slipping away from him. This wasn't how interviews usually went for Ethan Walker, or at least how they used to go. He had always been the one asking the difficult questions, making candidates squirm. "Look," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm sure you've done your research on me. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I trusted the wrong people. But I learned valuable lessons from that experience. Lessons I can bring to Horizon Industries." Olivia closed his file and set it aside. "You know, Mr. Walker, I find it fascinating how people's perspectives change when their circumstances do." She paused, watching his reaction. "5 years ago, I asked you for a simple courtesy, just a few minutes of shelter from the rain. You looked at me like I was nothing, less than nothing." So she did remember. Heat crept up Ethan's neck. I'm sorry about that," he stammered. "It was a bad day and Oh, I'm sure it was," she interrupted smoothly. "Just as I'm sure. Today isn't exactly going as planned for you either." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me something, Mr. Walker. If our positions were reversed right now, if you were sitting where I am and I was the desperate one, would you even remember me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Would he? The truth was, he probably wouldn't. That rainy day had been just one of countless interactions where he'd dismissed someone as unimportant. "I'd like to think I would," he said finally, knowing how hollow it sounded. A small, knowing smile played at her lips. "At least you're not a convincing liar. That's something." She tapped her fingers on the table thoughtfully. "You know, when I started this company 3 years ago, I made a promise to myself that I would never forget what it feels like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy." Ethan swallowed hard. There it was, the moment of judgment. She was going to throw him out, and he couldn't even blame her. It would be exactly what he deserved. But instead of dismissing him, Olivia opened a different folder and slid it across the table. "Let's talk about what position might be appropriate for someone with your particular blend of experience and humility." Ethan stared at the folder, then back at Olivia, confusion evident on his face. "You're still considering me for a position?" "I'm considering many things, Mr. Walker," Olivia replied, her expression unreadable, "including whether people can truly change when circumstances force them to." Unable to help himself, Ethan asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he recognized her. "How did you get here? From that night to this?" His gesture encompassed the impressive office, the company, her evident success. Olivia studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether his question deserved an answer. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "That night, after you drove away, I walked 6 blocks in the pouring rain because I couldn't afford a taxi and had missed the last bus," she began, her voice matter-of-fact. "I had just finished my 3rd interview that day and had been rejected from all of them. My student loans were piling up and I was one missed rent payment away from eviction." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "I remember standing outside your building, watching your car disappear into traffic and feeling this clarity. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was understanding. I realized that no one was going to give me anything in this world. Not shelter from the rain, not a job, not respect. I would have to take it all for myself. Ethan remained silent, listening. The next day, I took my last $300 and bought a domain name and hosting service. I started a tech blog, analyzing industry trends and offering solutions to common problems. It gained traction quickly. Turns out I had a knack for explaining complex tech concepts in ways regular people could understand. She turned to face him. 6 months later, I was consulting for small startups. A year after that, I had developed my first app and secured initial funding. 2 years in, I launched Horizon's first major product. Now we're valued at just over $3 billion. $3 billion. The number hit Ethan like a physical blow. His company, at its peak, had been worth half that. I read about your downfall, you know, she continued, returning to her seat. It was all over the business news. The great Ethan Walker, brought low by his own partner's greed and his own inattention. She tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the desk. I even considered reaching out at one point. Why didn't you? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Olivia's smile was enigmatic. I wanted to see where you'd land on your own, whether you'd claw your way back up or if the fall would break you completely. She tilted her head. And now here you are, sitting across from the girl you once couldn't spare a moment of kindness for, hoping she'll be kinder to you. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. Life has a strange sense of humor, he murmured. Indeed it does, Olivia agreed. Which brings us to an interesting crossroads, doesn't it? The question now is not just whether I should hire you, but whether you've learned enough from your fall to make it worth my while. Ethan met her gaze directly. I'm not the same man I was 5 years ago. No, she agreed. But are you a better one? That's what I intend to find out. A clock ticked somewhere in the corner of the room, each second punctuating the silence that had fallen between them. Ethan felt as if he were balanced on a knife's edge, his future hanging by the thinnest of threads. The folder Olivia had pushed across the table remained unopened. You know, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence, for years, I judged people in 30 seconds or less. One glance at their shoes, their watch, how they carried themselves, that was all I needed. I thought I had it figured out. Olivia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. When I looked at you that night, he continued, all I saw was an inconvenience, someone taking up space that wasn't meant for them. He shook his head slowly. I never stopped to think about your story, who you were, what you might become. Most people don't, Olivia replied. They're too wrapped up in their own narratives. It's a uniquely human failing. Ethan nodded. After everything fell apart, I kept waiting for someone to recognize me, to remember who I was, and offer me something based on my name alone. It took months before I realized that wasn't going to happen. And how did that feel? Olivia asked, her eyes never leaving his face. Terrifying, Ethan admitted. It was like I'd been stripped of my identity. Without my company, my status, my wealth. Who was I? What value did I actually have? And did you find an answer to that question? Ethan considered this. Had he? He'd spent the last few years focused on survival, on the next job application, the next rent payment. There hadn't been much time for philosophical reflection. I'm still working on it, he said finally. But I know I'm not just what I own or what position I hold. That's something at least. A ghost of a smile touched Olivia's lips. Indeed it is. She opened the folder she'd placed between them and turned it so he could see its contents. It wasn't a job description as he'd expected, but rather a printout of an old email, one he recognized immediately. It was from his company's HR department, dated 5 years ago, in response to a job application from Olivia Carter. We regret to inform you that we have chosen to pursue other candidates who better align with Walker Enterprises' company culture and values, the standard rejection read. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Too green, no connections, state school education, pass, EW. His own initials, his own dismissive judgment. You applied to work for me, Ethan said, the realization dawning. Before the rain. Olivia nodded. Fresh out of college with a computer science degree and big dreams, I'd applied to 67 companies that month. Yours was the last rejection before I changed strategies entirely. Ethan stared at his own callous handwriting. He didn't even remember writing that note. How many other careers had he casually dismissed with similarly thoughtless comments? Keep it as a reminder, Olivia said, closing the folder. Not out of bitterness, but because it represents a turning point. The moment I stopped asking for seats at other people's tables and decided to build my own. She leaned forward, elbows on the table. So, Mr. Walker, given our history, why should I hire you now? It was the question he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. The prepared speech he'd rehearsed about his qualifications and experience suddenly felt hollow and inadequate. Maybe you shouldn't, he said quietly. The words surprised even him. Olivia's eyebrows rose slightly at his response. That's not the answer I expected from Ethan Walker. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have given it, he admitted. But the truth is, I've made a career out of surrounding myself with people who wouldn't challenge me. Look where that got me. He gestured vaguely at himself, the slightly worn suit, the fading watch tan, where an expensive timepiece used to sit. You have every reason not to trust me. Olivia tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table, her eyes never leaving his face. After what felt like an eternity, she made a decision. Here's what I'm going to offer you, Mr. Walker. Not an executive position, not even close. I have an opening in our analytics department, entry-level work, analyzing market trends and customer feedback data. You'd report to a team leader who's probably 15 years younger than you. Ethan blinked. It was so far removed from his former status that it was almost laughable. Almost. The salary is $60,000 a year. Standard benefits package. 3-month probationary period. Olivia slid a different folder toward him. Take it or leave it. 6 years ago, Ethan had made that much in a week. His apartment had cost nearly that much per month. But now, with his checking account hovering near zero and eviction looming. I'll take it, he said without hesitation. Something that might have been surprise flickered across Olivia's face. Just like that? No negotiation? No reminders about your former position or expertise? Ethan shook his head. I need the job, and honestly, I'm not in a position to negotiate. No, she agreed. You're not. She stood and extended her hand. Welcome to Horizon Industries, Mr. Walker. You start tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp. Lisa at the front desk will get you set up with security clearance and show you to your workspace. The handshake was brief, professional. No warmth, but no animosity either. Just business. Thank you for this opportunity, Ethan said, meaning it. Don't thank me yet, Olivia replied. This isn't charity, and it certainly isn't forgiveness. It's a test, for both of us. The following morning, Ethan arrived at 7:45, clutching a coffee he'd made at home rather than splurging on the fancy cafe in the lobby. Lisa greeted him with efficient politeness, handed him an ID badge, and walked him through security protocols. By 8:15, he was being introduced to his new team, 5 millennials, all casually dressed in jeans and button-downs, who regarded him with mild curiosity. This is Ethan, our new data analyst, his team leader Maya announced. She couldn't have been more than 30, with bright blue highlights in her dark hair and an array of small silver earrings climbing up one ear. He's got some corporate background, so he'll be helping us with the Henderson account data migration. There was no mention of his past, no recognition in their eyes. To them, He was just another new hire, possibly an older, slightly out-of-touch one, judging by the way Maya explained the company's cloud storage system to him, as if he might be confused by it. His office turned out to be a desk in the open-plan workspace, sandwiched between a guy named Tyler, who wore noise-canceling headphones all day, and a woman named Jess, who had covered her desk area with succulents and motivational quotes. The work itself was mind-numbingly basic, feeding customer feedback into algorithms, tagging common complaints, tracking response patterns. It was work he would have delegated 3 levels down in his previous life. At lunch, he sat alone in the corner of the company cafeteria, watching the social dynamics unfold around him. No one approached him. No one sought his opinion or expertise. For the first time in his professional life, Ethan Walker was utterly unremarkable. 2 weeks into his new job, Ethan found himself staring at his computer screen, eyes burning from analyzing endless columns of customer data. His back ached from the ergonomically questionable chair, a far cry from the custom leather throne he'd once commanded. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd once made decisions affecting thousands of employees without giving a thought to details, like office furniture quality or the mind-numbing nature of data entry. "You look like you're contemplating a career change already," commented Jess, the succulent enthusiast at the next desk. It was the first personal remark anyone on the team had directed at him. Ethan managed a tired smile. "Just wondering if I'm getting too old for these marathon screen sessions." Jess laughed. "Wait till you see what Maya has planned for the quarterly review. You'll be dreaming in spreadsheets." She rolled her chair closer. Pro tip: the blue light glasses in the supply room actually help, and Nikki in IT can hook you up with a better chair if you bring him coffee for a week. It was such a small thing, office advice, freely given, but Ethan felt oddly touched by the gesture. "Thanks, I'll remember that." Later that afternoon, during a team meeting, Maya presented a problem with the Henderson account data. "We're getting inconsistent results from the customer satisfaction metrics. Something's off in the algorithm." The team brainstormed solutions, with Tyler suggesting a complete rewrite of the code, and Jess arguing for a simpler patch. Ethan sat quietly, listening. At his old company, he would have impatiently cut the discussion short and dictated a solution. "What do you think, Ethan?" Maya asked, surprising him. All eyes turned to him. Ethan cleared his throat. "Well, before we rewrite anything, we should check for pattern inconsistencies in the raw data. From what I've seen, Henderson changed their feedback form halfway through the quarter. We might be comparing apples to oranges." Maya considered this. "That actually makes sense. Can you pull those numbers and show us what you mean?" For the next hour, Ethan walked the team through his analysis. It wasn't revolutionary work, but it was solid, and it saved them from a potentially unnecessary code rewrite. The approving nod from Maya felt strangely more satisfying than closing million-dollar deals had in his past life. Days turned into weeks. Ethan settled into a routine. He found himself actually enjoying parts of the job, the problem-solving aspects, the immediate feedback of seeing solutions, work. He started bringing coffee for everyone on especially long days, remembered Tyler's birthday when the rest of the team forgot, and stayed late to help Jess prepare for an important presentation. Small changes, but meaningful ones. He began to notice things he'd been blind to before: how the maintenance staff came in at 5 a.m. to clean the offices, how the cafeteria workers remembered regular customers' preferences, how the complex machinery of a company functioned because of countless small contributions rather than just executive decisions. He saw Olivia occasionally, in company-wide meetings or passing in hallways. Sometimes he felt her watching him from a distance, evaluating, measuring. But she never approached, never singled him out. The message was clear. This was his test to pass or fail on his own merits. One rainy evening, working late, Ethan encountered Maya struggling with a presentation for the board. "The data's all here," she said, frustration evident in her voice, "but I can't make it tell the story we need." In his old life, Ethan would have seen this as weakness. Now, he recognized an Opportunity to help, may I? He asked, gesturing to her laptop. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side, restructuring the presentation to emphasize key findings and create a compelling narrative from the data. When they finished, Maya looked at him with new respect. You're really good at this. Where did you learn to present data like that? Ethan smiled sadly. Let's just say I've sat through enough bad presentations to know what works and what doesn't. Maya nodded, clearly curious but polite enough not to pry. Well, thanks for the help. The team's grabbing drinks tomorrow after work if you want to join us. No pressure, though. It was a small invitation, casually offered, but to Ethan, it felt like the first genuine acceptance he'd experienced in years. 3 months passed in a blur of spreadsheets, team meetings, and gradually warming relationships. Ethan had surprised himself by accepting Maya's invitation for drinks that night, and even more surprisingly, he'd enjoyed it. His teammates were smart, passionate, and refreshingly honest. Qualities he'd often overlooked in employees during his CEO days. The morning of his quarterly review arrived with a knot of tension in Ethan's stomach. His probationary period was ending, and while he felt he'd done good work, he couldn't shake the fear that Olivia had simply been biding her time, waiting for this moment to cut him loose. Walker, Maya called across the office. Meeting room 3, 10 minutes. Ethan nodded, straightening his tie, a habit from his former life that he couldn't quite shake, even though most of his colleagues rarely wore anything more formal than a button-down shirt. When he entered the meeting room, he was surprised to find not only Maya waiting for him, but also Olivia and the department head, James Chen. Olivia sat at the far end of the table, observing silently. Take a seat, Ethan, James said, gesturing to an empty chair. We've been reviewing your first quarter performance. Ethan sat, his face carefully neutral despite the nerves churning inside him. I hope it's been satisfactory. Maya smiled. Actually, it's been more than satisfactory. The Henderson project feedback was exceptional. Your data analysis helped us identify trends we might have missed, and your suggestions for the customer portal redesign were implemented almost entirely. We're particularly impressed with how you've integrated with the team, James added. Maya tells me you've become something of a mentor to some of the junior analysts. Ethan blinked in surprise. He hadn't thought of himself that way, but he had been sharing tips with Jess and helping Tyler refine his presentation skills. I've just been trying to be useful, he said honestly. They're all incredibly talented. Yes, they are, Olivia spoke for the first time, her eyes studying him. Which makes your contribution all the more noteworthy. You didn't try to overshadow them or take credit for their work. You supported them. That's not what I expected from you. There was a note in her voice that Ethan couldn't quite identify, curiosity perhaps, or mild surprise. I've learned that success isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room, Ethan said quietly. Sometimes it's about making sure everyone's voice gets heard. James nodded approvingly. Well, based on your performance, we'd like to offer you a permanent position. Same role for now, but with the potential for advancement as opportunities arise. There's also a modest salary increase. He slid a document across the table. The terms were fair, still, well below what Ethan had once earned, but comfortably above what he needed to survive. More importantly, it represented security, a foothold in rebuilding his life. I accept, Ethan said without hesitation, and thank you for the opportunity. I won't let the team down. After James and Maya left, Olivia remained, studying him with that same thoughtful expression. I have to admit, I'm surprised, she said finally. When I offered you this position, I half expected you to quit within the first week. The Ethan Walker I met 5 years ago would never have tolerated such a demotion. Ethan considered this. The Ethan Walker you met 5 years ago needed to be taken down a few pegs, or maybe a few hundred. 6 months flew by in a whirlwind of projects, late nights, and unexpected friendships. Ethan had thrown himself into the community outreach program Olivia had mentioned, drawing on connections from his past life who were still willing to take his calls. The initiative had expanded beyond its original scope, now including mentorship programs, coding workshops, and even a scholarship fund for promising students from low-income backgrounds. On a particularly busy Tuesday morning, Ethan was deep in analyzing user data for a new app launch when Maya appeared at his desk. "Olivia wants to see you," she said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Conference room A, as soon as possible." Ethan saved his work and stood, smoothing down his shirt. Conference room A was where the executive team met. He hadn't set foot in there since his initial interview. "Any idea what this is about?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Maya shrugged. "No clue, but your numbers have been solid, so I wouldn't worry too much." She gave him an encouraging smile. "Maybe it's about the community program. The feedback from the last workshop was off the charts." Ethan nodded, but as he walked toward the executive floor, he couldn't help feeling a flutter of anxiety. Despite his progress, despite the relationships he'd built and the work he'd done, part of him still expected the other shoe to drop, for Olivia to reveal that this had all been an elaborate lesson in humility before showing him the door. The conference room was empty when he arrived, except for Olivia, who stood looking out over the city skyline. She turned as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Take a seat, Ethan," she said, gesturing to a chair beside her rather than across the table. It was a small difference, but significant, a subtle shift in their dynamic. Ethan sat, waiting for her to speak first. "I've been reviewing the quarterly reports," Olivia began, opening a folder on the table. "Particularly the progress on our community initiatives. The board is impressed. We've seen a 30% increase in positive brand perception and a significant uptick in job applications from diverse candidates." "The team's worked hard," Ethan said. "Tyler especially has put in countless hours on the mentorship program." "Yes, but according to Maya, you're the one who redesigned the entire approach, secured additional funding, and personally taught several of the weekend workshops." Olivia closed the folder. "That wasn't part of your job description." Ethan shifted slightly. "I saw an opportunity to make a real difference. Besides, I had some experience that could help." "Indeed." Olivia studied him for a long moment. "You've changed, Ethan. When you first came here, I was certain this was just a stopgap for you, something to tide you over until you could claw your way back to a corner office somewhere." "It started that way," Ethan admitted. "But somewhere along the line, the work became more than just a paycheck. These kids in our program, they remind me of why I got into business in the first place, to build something meaningful." Olivia nodded slowly. "I have a proposition for you. We're expanding the community initiative into a separate division, with its own budget and team. It needs a director, someone who understands both the corporate side and the human element." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You're offering me a promotion?" "I'm offering you a chance to continue the work you've clearly become passionate about," Olivia corrected. "The salary is better than your current position, though still not what you once earned. You'd report directly to me, and you'd have a significant say in how we allocate resources." Ethan felt an unexpected surge of excitement. Not for the status or the title, but for the possibilities. "I'd like that very much," he said simply. "Before you accept," Olivia cautioned, "I need to know something. If I hadn't given you this chance, if we'd never crossed paths again after that rainy night, what do you think would have happened to you?" Ethan took a deep breath, considering Olivia's question carefully. It wasn't hypothetical. It struck at the heart of everything that had happened to him over the past year. "Honestly, I probably would have found another corporate job eventually, something below my previous level but respectable enough. I'd have clung to whatever status I could salvage." He shook his head slightly. "But I would have missed the most important lesson." "Which is," Olivia prompted, "that success isn't measured by your title or your bank account. It's measured by the impact you have on others. Ethan looked out at the city skyline. I spent 15 years building a company that made money. Just money. When it collapsed, there was nothing left. No legacy, no lasting impact, nothing that mattered. Olivia nodded slowly. And now? A small smile touched Ethan's lips. Now, I'm helping kids who remind me of myself at their age, before the ambition and greed took over. Kids with potential who just need someone to believe in them. That feels like something worth building. Silence fell between them, but it wasn't. Uncomfortable. Finally, Olivia reached for another folder on the table. There's something else I want to discuss with you, she said, her tone shifting slightly. Something beyond the community program. She opened the folder and pushed a document toward him. Ethan glanced down, then did a double take as he registered what he was reading. It was a proposal for Horizon to acquire the remaining assets of Walker Enterprises, the patents, the client list, what little remained of his former company. I don't understand, Ethan said, looking up at her with confusion. Your former company still holds valuable intellectual property, Olivia explained. Property that could be useful to Horizon as we expand into new markets. The shareholders are willing to sell for a reasonable price, considering the circumstances. Ethan stared at the proposal, emotions churning inside him. His company, or what was left of it, being absorbed by Horizon, would be the final chapter in the story of his fall. And yet, strangely, he felt no anger or resentment at the idea. It makes good business sense, he said finally. Those patents could integrate well with your current product line. Our current product line, Olivia corrected gently. Which brings me to the second part of my proposal. She turned to the next page in the document. This one detailed a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to the CEO, responsible for integrating the acquired assets and developing new product strategies. You want me to... Ethan trailed off, hardly daring to believe what he was reading. I want you to help me make something meaningful out of what remains of your company, Olivia said. Not as a favor to you, but because you have knowledge and expertise that could genuinely benefit Horizon. This is a business decision, Ethan. He studied her face, searching for any hidden motive. Pity, perhaps, or some elaborate form of revenge, but found only calm assessment and professional regard. Why? He asked simply. After everything, after how I treated you, why offer me this? Olivia considered her answer carefully. Initially, when I brought you in, it was partly curiosity and partly, I don't know, maybe a desire for some cosmic justice. I wanted to see if the mighty Ethan Walker could handle being at the bottom for once. She paused, collecting her thoughts. But watching you these past months, seeing how you've worked with the team, how you've approached the community program, I've realized something important. People can change. Not everyone, not completely, but enough to matter. You've proven that. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not pain but a strange mixture of gratitude and determination. I won't let you down, he said quietly. I know you won't, Olivia replied with surprising confidence. Because now, you understand something critical that you didn't before. Every person has value, regardless of their title or status, even the ones standing in the rain. 1 year later, Horizon Industries had nearly doubled in size. The acquisition of Walker Enterprises patents had opened new markets, and Ethan's innovative approach to product development had yielded 3 successful launches. The community program had expanded to 5 cities, with plans for international growth. Ethan's office on the executive floor was modest by his former standards, but comfortable. Unlike his old workspace, the walls held no expensive art, no framed magazine covers featuring his face. Instead, there were photographs of community program graduates, handwritten thank you notes from students, and a simple framed quote. Success is measured by impact, not income. A knock at his door interrupted his review of quarterly projections. Maya leaned in, now the director of data analytics after her own well-deserved promotion. "Executive meeting in 10, she reminded him. "Olivia wants everyone's input on the expansion plans." Ethan nodded, gathering his notes. The dynamic between him and Olivia had evolved into something unexpected. Partnership based on mutual respect and shared vision. They disagreed often, challenged each other frequently, but always with the company's best interests at heart. As he walked toward the conference room, his phone buzzed with a weather alert. Severe thunderstorms expected this afternoon. He paused by the window, watching as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Rain had once been just an inconvenience to him, something that might ruin an expensive suit or delay his driver. Now, it carried different associations. The executive meeting ran long, as they often did when discussing major initiatives. By the time they finished, the storm had arrived in full force, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. Ethan was heading back to his office when he noticed a commotion in the lobby. A young woman stood just inside the entrance, dripping wet despite the small umbrella clutched in her hand. The security guard was speaking to her, his expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, miss, but without an appointment." Ethan approached them, curious. "Is everything all right?" The young woman looked up, clearly embarrassed. "I'm here for the internship interview, but I'm early. The rain was getting worse, so I thought maybe I could wait inside, but..." She gestured, helplessly at her soaked condition. The security guard turned to Ethan. "Company policy, sir. No visitors without appointments until their scheduled time." Ethan studied the young woman, college-aged, clutching a portfolio that she'd managed to keep dry despite her own drenched state. Her shoes were worn at the edges, but polished. There was determination in her eyes, a familiar kind of hunger. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zoe Reynolds," she replied, standing a little straighter. "My interview is at 3. Ethan checked his watch. "That's nearly 2 hours from now." He made a decision. "Jerry, she's with me. I'll take responsibility." The security guard nodded immediately. "Yes, sir, Mr. Walker." Turning to Zoe, Ethan smiled. "Let's find you a place to dry off and prepare for your interview. The cafe on the second floor makes excellent hot chocolate." The relief and gratitude in her eyes reminded him of something, or rather someone. Himself, perhaps, when Olivia had first given him a chance he hadn't deserved. As they walked toward the elevator, Zoe clutching her portfolio nervously, Ethan felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Olivia standing there, a knowing smile on her face. "I was going to ask about the Johnson contract, but it can wait," she said, her eyes moving between Ethan and the soaking wet young woman. "Helping our visitors weather the storm?" Ethan nodded. It seemed like the right thing to do. "It is," Olivia agreed simply. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, a world of understanding passed between them. Then she turned to Zoe with a warm smile. "Welcome to Horizon Industries, Ms. Reynolds. I hope you find it as transformative as Mr. Walker has." As they continued to the elevator, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The circle had closed. The man who had once turned away from someone in need was gone, replaced by someone who understood the value of compassion, of second chances. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. Inside, in the warm light of the building he'd once entered as a desperate job seeker, Ethan Walker had found something he never expected. Not just redemption, but purpose. And in the end, that was worth more than all he had lost.